let's get straight into the Vietnam War. Perfect day to do it because it is bloody freezing. It's 8 degrees here and windy as hell. We're in our shed so we can both get in. Lights bad, winds bad, temperatures damn freezing. But we're going to go to Vietnam because that'll be a bit warmer, and we're going to do a book review. How many books have you read about Vietnam? How many books have been written about Vietnam? How many documentaries? Truth, fiction, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, you name it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a book review. We're going to do a book review of a book that I heard about in 1977. I heard about this book and it got a lot of publicity and it was all bad. And that was because the publicity was around one particular quote was that a gunner in a helicopter was asked, "How can you shoot children?" And his reply was, "You just don't lead them so much." Now, if you know anything about shooting moving targets, you shoot in front of the target because you want to be shooting it where the moving target will be, not where it is when you're shooting. That's called leading. And so when the journalist said, "How can you shoot children?" the gunner said, "You just don't lead them as much." Because of that one comment, got a lot of publicity from the book. The book was thought that it was going to be banned in Australia. So I put an order in straight away and was fortunate enough that the particular bookshop in Hindley Street, Adelaide, was able to get in half a dozen copies or so, one of which I pre-ordered. And so, yes, in case you haven't guessed, the book is Dispatches, and it's written by Michael Herr. And let's have a bit of history about the guy and who he was writing for before we get into the book. This is a first edition of that book, and what happened is that there was a magazine called Esquire. When you think of Esquire magazine, you might think of Playboy or Penthouse and think it's a bit rude or risque. Well, Esquire was a men's magazine, but it really was a magazine about men's fashion and men's issues. It really was supposed to be a magazine about articles, magazine about articles. But what happened is in the 40s, they started to put Vargas drawings in the magazine. Now, if you know Vargas, if you're my age, you'd certainly know Vargas. If you're a World War II fan, you'd know Vargas from nose art on bombers, where the scantily dressed Where's Jane and the Memphis Belle, those sort of things, that risque nose art was by a man called Vargas. And they were things like a woman would be getting off a bus. They're sketches but very lifelike. Woman would be getting off a bus and her dress would be caught on a hinge or something and it would pull up. Or she'd be changing a tyre of a car and her dress would all be pulled up. You'd see her stocking tops and that sort of stuff. So in in modern thinking, that is not even risque. But back then it was seen as being very rude. And so because the magazine was a subscription magazine and was sent out through the mail, the American Postal Service, the Postal Service tried to take action against Esquire magazine for sending pornography in the mail. And because of the American First Amendment, the right to free speech and the right of the media, it was seen to be that they could continue to post out those magazines. But really it still tainted Esquire magazine a little bit, that it was a bit risque, even though it really wasn't. So Michael Herr, the guy who wrote Dispatches, he was born in 1940. Might as well say now that he died in 2016, aged 76. And in the early 60s, he started writing for Esquire magazine. In 67, while he was already a writer for Esquire magazine, he went off to Vietnam to cover Vietnam for Esquire magazine and to write articles for Esquire magazine. So he was with I've had to be very careful with this video because there are a myriad of rabbit holes to go down that would make this a 4-hour video. I wouldn't even do it justice. So I've got to be real careful because we've got Errol Flynn's son, Sean. We've got Dana Stone. We've got so many rabbit holes. So let's just stick to, am I already editing stuff out? Let's just stick to Michael Herr, 67, goes to Vietnam, height of the Vietnam War to a degree, 67, 69. There's another rabbit hole about how many troops went in which particular years. We're going to cover all of this in other videos. He was there, 67, 69, height of the war, with other journalists that were given carte blanche to go anywhere they wanted, jump on any helicopter they wanted, any gunship, any Chinook, go with any convoy, go to Khe Sanh, do whatever they wanted to do, they were able to do it. And so Michael Herr got to go to some of the most huge firefights and dangerous places and had many close calls. And what happened was, I'm leaving chunks out for other videos, but at the end, when he decides to go home, he has not submitted too many articles, and that's because Esquire magazine is more of a men's article magazine, thoughtful, deep reading, takes more time to write them. It is not a New York Times type publication. The New York Times wanted a story. You were in action today. They wanted it written straight away so they could publish it tomorrow and they could beat the London newspapers or the Japanese newspapers. They wanted to be first with the stories. Michael Herr wasn't in that position, so he kept notebooks, and in '69 when he went back to America, his intention was, instead of writing all these articles for the magazine, he was going to write a book. Now, Michael Herr saw some shocking things. It's all in a book about what he saw, the dreadful things of war that he saw, and there were some well-publicized massacres and atrocities committed by American troops in Vietnam. It's a fact. War is hell. Michael Herr saw this hell of women and children being killed by the Americans, by the Viet Cong, what the Viet Cong did to their own people. We'll talk about Tet in another video and what happened in Tet. But he saw some shocking things. So when he went back to America, what he says started to happen is he would wake up in the middle of the night and his room that he was in would be piled high. He would be surrounded and piled high with dead Marines. And he would feel compelled, a compulsion, an obsessive compulsion, that he had to cover up the faces of all these dead Marines. And when he woke up from this nightmare of a room filled with dead Marines, he would still, while he's up, while he's smoking, while he's having a drink, he's still got this compulsion to cover their dead faces. So this is classic post-traumatic stress. That's what he suffered from, even though 69, it wasn't really understood much then, really. He suffered for this for 5 years. Then he goes on the road, he's out with a rock and roller. The other thing about Dispatches is it talks a lot about the music of the time. When you were in Vietnam, you were listening to that music, that pivotal music of the 60s all the time. Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, Mothers of Invention, Frank Zappa. You were hearing all this music. We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do. All of those songs, classic songs of the 60s, are ingrained in any Vietnam vet's brain. And they were in Michael's brain. And so he went on the road with a rock and roller and finally, at last, managed to write Dispatches. And that's the book. Now when you read this book, you'll understand why it came close to being banned in Australia. And when I say it's close to being banned in Australia, having said that, when I put an order in to make sure I got a copy of this book, this very book here, John le Carré was a very famous writer, pumping out millions of spy novels. And John le Carré said, "This is the best book I have ever read on men and war." At the same time, when this book came out, the New York Times said, "This is the best book that has ever been written about war." And later, they amended that to say, "This is the best book that has ever been written about the Vietnam War." And then when the very prestigious English newspaper, The Guardian, published a list of the 100 best non-fiction books ever written, this is on that list, Dispatches by Michael Herr. Now, if you saw my book review about the forgotten soldier, the half French, half German young teenager who gets recruited into the German army, basically into the SS, and then serves his entire wartime career on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians, you'll know that when that book came out, it received a lot of positive review, but it also had what we call today the haters, the Facebook haters. People came on board wanting to say that battalion was never in that area at that time. He is not recorded as being a casualty in that hospital at that time. As the years, decades went past, of course, about the forgotten soldier, they have turned around and said, hang on, that man is going from memory. He took no notes, he had no diaries, and we accept that he got some things wrong, but he was there, and it's a wonderful, incredible book about a man on the Eastern Front. So what happened is exactly the same thing happened with Michael Kerr. In this book, occasionally he names a Marine grunt, a private, and names them and talks about what they did. And the armchair critics, the armchair experts, went looking for the records of particular soldiers that get mentioned in this book, and they couldn't find them. And so later, when he was interviewed, he admits that some of the things in this book are not fictional, but they are things that happened in a different location, or there's something that happened and he didn't know the name of who it happened to, so he made up the name of that particular private. And what he tries to get in his interviews isn't that this is a fictional book, it's simply not a day, date, name, perfect account of what happened. You've got to remember the state he was in. A lot of them were turning to alcohol and drugs to survive. And the sort of things that he mentions in here, I've already said, the comment, how do you shoot children? You don't lead them so much. He also mentions that one officer was saying there is only one way to win the Vietnam War. We put all of the Vietnamese that are on our side on boats. We take them well out to sea. We then completely devastate the country with nuclear weapons, and then we sink the boats. The comments in here about things that guys had written on their helmets and their flak jackets. The fact that he went to a particular camp once and was, spoiler alert, maybe you don't want to hear this bit, but he saw a Marine was trying to skin a Viet Cong, and an officer rushed up and said to the Marine, "Are you crazy? What do you think you're doing? Doing that in front of journalists. Not, what do you think you're doing? Skinning a human being, but we're doing it when there are journalists around." And these are the sort of things that are recorded in this book that are distasteful and unpleasant, and they're things that we perhaps would rather not think about, and the atrocities that you hear that are committed by other soldiers, enemy in other wars, and then you read things about American soldiers. It's not that they are German soldiers or American soldiers, it is that people are human beings. Very poignant comments in this book, and I think one of the most telling ones is he says, "The young ones were so innocent and violent, so sweet and so brutal. They were beautiful killers." And this is what's hard to get across to people, is the fact that if you take an 18, 19, 20-year-old teenager, they have a different moral compass. The conscience isn't so well developed, the feelings of empathy aren't, and it's easy to make 18 and 19-year-olds into killers, and it's just a sad fact of life. He tells fascinating stories about China Beach, where the Marines went for R&R and the things that happened there. He mentions a sign that he sees at one base camp. The sign says, "If you kill for money, you're a mercenary. If you kill for pleasure, you're a sadist. But if you kill for money and pleasure, you're a Green Beret." They're the sort of things that get mentioned in this book, of things that he saw. He saw a flak jacket and it had written on it, "A sucking chest wound is nature's way of telling you you've been in a firefight." He asks one officer why they seem to have stopped calling the Viet Cong, they've stopped calling them Charlie, and they've gone to Dinks and Gooks. And the officer explains that when they first came, Americans first came to Vietnam as advisors, though Viet Cong, that got shortened to VC. VC in the phonetic alphabet is Victor Charlie, and of course the way things get shortened down, that got changed to Charlie. And so initially the Viet Cong were called Charlie. But too many Americans had friends and relatives that they liked and loved who were called Charlie, and so they didn't want to call the Viet Cong Charlie anymore. And so the story goes, they saw them as being little rinky-dinks, and so that's how it then became Dinks and Gooks. Terrible expressions, and maybe we'll get this video banned, because you can't, certainly on Facebook, if you said that, you would be banned for a month, if not have your account completely closed down. But where do you draw the line at telling history as it happened, or whitewashing it all? So we're going to wrap this up now. At least a dozen videos are going to come from this book and from the subject of the Vietnam War. But what I'm going to leave you with is two movies. Have you seen Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket? And have you seen Apocalypse Now? Both of those movies take a lot from this book. Both directors say they were inspired significantly by this book. Michael Herr had a lot to do with the screenplay, scripts and content of both those movies, Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now. And many of the things that you will read in this book are included in both of those films from things that Michael Herr saw when he was in Vietnam. Perhaps the last thing I'll leave you with is that the reason Michael Herr finally said enough is enough, left Vietnam and came home, is because when he first arrived there in '67, an Australian journalist made friends with him. It was his first friend. He initially had a little bit of trouble when he went there, because he was covering it for Esquire magazine. He was covering the Vietnam War for a men's magazine, where all the other correspondents there were seen to be more serious. He was seen to be light. They were the heavyweights. Time, The Guardian, important mainstream journalists. So this journalist took him under his wing, became a very good, close friend. And what happened is that journalist, whose name was John Cantwell, C-A-N-T-W-E-L-L. Don't really go Googling, because you will not find much about John, which is a bit of a shame. But what happened with this Australian journalist is the Tet Offensive occurred, and when that occurred, the Viet Cong attacked Saigon. They attacked the racecourse, and they attacked the French Quarter. They attacked the French cemetery, and they did this purely as a terror act. Saigon was heavily held by the Americans. When they attacked these areas, it was a very, very short distance from where all of the journalists were staying in a major hotel. 5 of those journalists raced and jumped in a mini moke. You might read that it was a Jeep. It was not an American Jeep. They jumped in a mini moke, and they drove a short distance to where there was a lot of gunfire, the 5 of them, 2 Australians altogether. But John Cantwell was ambushed by the Viet Cong, and although they were calling out journalist, the story goes by the one survivor of the 5 journalists in the mini moke turned into an alleyway, came upon heavily armed Viet Cong. The one survivor, who played dead and managed to escape by the skin of his teeth, said that when they were calling journalist, laughingly the Viet Cong called back journalist, as they machine gunned them and killed 4 outright, including Michael Her's first and best friend in Vietnam, John Cantwell. And that is why Michael finally decided enough's enough, and he was going to go back home. So I'm looking at doing a John Cantwell video. Hard to research him because there's not a lot of information. He was living in Hong Kong at the time. He was married to a Chinese woman, and so it's hard to track down any information on him. Long video that wasn't meant to be. Book review, Michael Her, Dispatches, my prized, treasured first edition from 1977. Wasn't reprinted for over 20 years, I think. See if you can grab yourself a copy of one of the best, of the 100 best non-fiction books of all time. Cheers.